All right, everyone. So what we're going to be doing in this series of lecture videos is looking at the process of photosynthesis. So to give us some context, right, we've already talked about what happens with cellular respiration. The notion that us taking a molecule that's very high energy, that has a lot of stored potential, and converting it into a usable form for a biological system. So in our case, taking glucose, breaking it down using glycolysis, parts of the citric acid cycle, and into the electron transport chain for us to get a lot of ATP, which allows us to carry out all of the major functions necessary for our cells to function. So this process that we're going to be addressing is how do we end up creating those high energy molecules? How do we create something like glucose that allows us to transfer a lot of energy later down the line? So there's a couple things that we want to be thinking about as we go through the system, right? We want to think about how would we design a system to capture energy from the sun and convert it into a useful form. Okay, and so think about it. Plants, and when I say plants, again, I'm totally biased because I like plants. But you also think about all the other organisms that are capable of doing photosynthesis. That could be algae, right? That could be bacteria, some protists, right? All of these different things carry the ability to do photosynthesis. So the process of taking light energy and converting it into a usable form. Okay. So plants have solved this issue by taking advantage of the byproducts of cellular respiration so that they can use those to continue the cyclical nature of the process to continue to create energy that's actually in a usable form. Okay, so for this, we're going to be focusing on a few different aspects of the introductory thing. We're going to be looking at the components and the major kind of structural pieces that are related to photosynthesis, and then kind of get into a broad overview of the types of reactions that happen. And then our next video, we're going to be looking at the very specifics of it. We're going to be going through the entirety of the cycle and talking about the products that are produced along the way as we go through the process of cellular respiration. All right, so first here with chlorophyll. Right, so chlorophyll and chloroplast, those are kind of our big structures that we're going to look at. So we have to think about what's the role that these particular molecules play in the process of photosynthesis. So you might recall a little bit about pigments, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but I just wanted to define here the actual definition of photosynthesis. And that definition is that you have a process that uses light, so photo referring to light, to produce some kind of new product, some kind of new chemical. So in our case, specifically molecules that store light energy, that they have a high potential that we can utilize later. All right, so again, photosynthesis in photosynthetic organisms will capture that energy from sunlight using specific pigments in order to do that. Okay. So before we can actually review and talk about the different pigments that are involved in this, we have to actually talk about light. Okay, right? That's our main source of energy. That's the thing that we're actually taking and converting into a form that we as animals can utilize. So again, energy in the forms that we utilize there coming from the sun, right? The sun is our major source of energy on the planet. That's what all of the plants and things that are doing photosynthesis utilize in order to be able to take energy and form it into something functional. Okay. So energy from the sun is going to travel to the earth in the form of light, right? We know that light is composed of different waves, right? And those different wavelengths get absorbed by these pigments and excite different particles, so in this case electrons, and so that to transfer that particular energy. You need to remember that sunlight is a mixture of all of these different wavelengths. And so many of these are visible to our eye. So we're going to kind of focus on the visible spectrum. But you also have to realize that there are parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we don't see, that the majority of it is stuff that we don't see, right? Anything that's got our smaller wavelength than 400 nanometers, right, is in that ultraviolet to the X-ray to the gamma ray range, and then anything less than or anything greater than 750 in terms of the wavelength is going to be our infrared, our microwaves and radio waves, right? So again, those longer wavelengths that we use for other things. Okay, so like we may harness them for different things, but again, plants and things that photosynthesize are going to use visible light as well as all of these other different ranges because of different pigments to excite the electrons, to excite these pigments to create a way for us to absorb and harness that light energy. Okay. So you have to remember, like, we as humans are capable of seeing a limited range of the spectrum. We call it the visible spectrum of light. And we can see from anywhere from about 400 nanometers to like 750 nanometers in length, right, of a wave. Okay, so we can see what's happening in those particular parts of the spectrum. Remember, all of these waves are traveling at the same speed. They all are traveling at the speed of light, but what the variation is due to the frequency in which that wavelength goes up and down. So again, higher frequency things generally have a lower wavelength, and those that have a higher wavelength generally have a lower frequency. Okay, so in our case, when we're looking at the light, we're going to be looking at like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? Parts of the visible spectrum, like the rainbow colors that we're going to be addressing. Okay, so when we're thinking about light and what we can actually see, right? Think about the plants and the pigments in them actually seeing those pigments, right? They're actually interacting with those pigments, and when they can interact, right, they're actually, that wavelength is interacting with a particular thing. So for example, our eyes with the cones and rods, right, they're absorbing various parts of the spectrum, and we're able to interpret that because of the types of interactions these wavelengths have with our eyes, with our retinas, to convey an image to our brain that we can interpret as color. Again, assuming that you have those particular structures. If you're colorblind, I'm sorry, you can't see those particular things. Right? But in our case, if we are assuming that everyone can see the spectrum of color, it's that process, right? The signaling from that particular wavelength that gets sent to our brains. All right, so the main component that allows molecules inside of a cell to be able to do this, especially in a photosynthetic cell, is that plants garner the sun's energy through pigments, right? These particular structures and molecules that allow us to excite various components of it, usually some kind of ion, to convey and transfer electrons in a particular way. And so when we're talking about plants, and again, all photosynthetic things, I'm biased when I wrote this, I'm just thinking plants, is that with all of these photosynthetic organisms, right, their main photosynthetic pigment is chlorophyll. Okay, so chlorophyll is the main one that's going to be absorbing a large portion of the spectrum, but not all of it. Okay. So what I have here is a diagram of the actual absorption spectrum of our light waves. And so here's our wavelength on the x-axis. Here's our estimated absorption. So again, absorption is the idea of taking all of that energy from that wavelength of light and being able to transfer it into excited electrons. Okay, so there are two types of chlorophyll that are actually found inside of plants and other photosynthetic organisms. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. So they're structurally a little bit different, but their main job is to absorb various components of the spectrum of visible light and take that energy and convert it into a form that then we can use later on as we're trying to build these large carbon-based molecules. Okay. So the two types of chlorophyll that we have, chlorophyll A and B, if you look at this graph and we look at the absorption, right, we notice that our absorption and the highest peaks of those are around this violet-blue spectrum. So we have peaks with chlorophyll A in the violet range, peaks with chlorophyll B in the kind of blue-violet range. Not much going on in the greens and yellows, but then we're absorbing the light energy here in the orange range and then in this red range, right? So this orange to red range. Okay, so what does that tell you about the light that you're actually seeing, right? What that tells me when I look at this particular graph is that I'm absorbing a lot of the light waves that are happening here, this blue-violet spectrum and this orange-red spectrum, but I'm not absorbing very much energy of light in this kind of green-yellow spectrum, okay? So what does that mean? Right? If you're looking at a leaf, right, outside in nature, right, chances are the color that you are seeing on that particular leaf is green. And that is because if you think about the light that's being absorbed, right, that means that light is no longer available for our eyes to see. So the light that you see is the light that is reflected off the surface of the leaf, that's reflected from these pigments back to your eye, and you interpret that light based on its wavelength as green. Okay, so if you think about it, chlorophyll as a pigment doesn't absorb green light. It reflects it. It actually absorbs the spectrum outside of the green range. So that's why you're seeing everything green that photosynthesizes, because of the pigments, chlorophyll, not being very good at picking up those wavelengths, but being very good at picking up the blue and the violet, the orange and the red. Okay, so leaves reflect green light, so that's why we see them as green, because they absorb everything else. The other thing to note about plants and other photosynthetic things is that they have other pigments inside of them. It's not just chlorophyll that is absorbing energy from light. There are other things called carotenoids. There are red pigments called anthocyanins. Those pigments will also do the same thing. They will get excited by light energy, and that light energy then gets transferred via electrons in a similar process to what's happening inside of cellular respiration to transmit energy from those excited states because of the light that they're absorbing. So carotenoids, if you look at this, these are usually yellow pigments, right? Those are kind of the color that you end up seeing. All right, if you see here, right, they're going to be absorbing things in the violet, blue, and part of the green spectrum, but again, reflecting kind of the yellow, orange, and red colors that you see. So if we're talking about how those pigments are actually being conveyed, right, most of the time that green pigment is going to be overwhelmed, right? Your leaves contain so much more of it than any other pigment. So, but as like say winter comes along and we're trying to break down chlorophyll because it's relatively energetically expensive to produce, right? We know that during the winter we're not going to have as much light, so it makes more sense to break those things down, to store those for a time when you're able to utilize more of the light spectrum, like during the spring and summer when you have just more time in the day with light. And you can break those down, store those in the roots and inside the stems and things inside the plant or within different parts of the cell, like the vacuoles for single cell things that can do cellular respiration, or bacteria, they'll just be green. But what they'll do is they'll break those down, and that's when you start to see the remainders of those colors. So like carotenoids, anthocyanins that bring in that orange yellow color that you see. Okay, so that's kind of what's left over. So when you're looking at autumn and the leaves are changing color, it's because they're taking in that chlorophyll to save it for later, and you're only seeing the presentation of those anthocyanins in each of the cells. Okay, so that's why your leaves turn colors, and that's why you see kind of this beautiful array of reds and oranges as green starts to dissipate. All right, so let's talk about the structure inside of your cell that actually allows for this process to happen. Okay, so photosynthesis takes place inside of an organelle. Okay, and so we're again focusing on the eukaryotes, we're focusing on plants essentially, and how those carry out photosynthesis. So again, just remember plants only carry out a small portion of the total amount of photosynthesis that happens on the planet. There are other things that do the majority of it. Protists and bacteria actually carry out well over 50–60% of the photosynthesis, probably even higher than that, of all of the potential reaction of photosynthesis that happens on the planet. So just keep that in mind. Plants are abundant. They carry out a lot of photosynthesis, but we are very biased, right? We use plants a lot, and that's why we're focusing on them as a whole. Okay. So photosynthesis takes place in these organelles, specifically in a structure known as the chloroplast. And so the chloroplast is very similar to the idea of a mitochondria, right? You have this membrane-bound organelle that has another membrane around it, right? Because it was probably absorbed by an ancient cell to essentially carry out this function, right? There was some cell that developed the ability to produce these particular reactions, and these particular reactions were very beneficial to cells, so they absorbed them. And then because they were so beneficial, those cells were continued to propagate, and that's why we have photosynthetic things these days. Okay. So there's structures inside of this that actually carry out the process. And so those two structures are they're called thylakoids. So inside of the membrane, inside of the inner membranes, the outer and inner membranes, you're going to have the structure of the thylakoid. And so the thylakoid is a membrane-bound structure inside of that actually form these intricate stacks. Okay, and so these stacks we call a stack of thylakoids of grana. Okay, so you have a bunch of grana stacked on top of each other, and you have space inside the membrane, and then you have the area outside that we call the stroma. Okay, so those are our major structures that are in there. Okay, and so here's kind of a little bit more zoomed in image of that. So here's our granum, again, our stack of thylakoids. Our thylakoid is each of these individual spaces here. You have the membrane of the thylakoid, and then this internal space inside the thylakoid. Okay. So like in our mitochondria, when we talked about the cristae and the folds, right? This is where the reactions are occurring that we're going to address in our next lecture video. They're all happening across this thylakoid membrane. Okay. All right, so pigments, again, are located inside of the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so they're actually found in this area here. This is where we're going to get our chlorophyll, our carotenoids, our anthocyanins. Okay. And then the fluid portion outside of that, we call it the stroma. So the stroma is within the inner membrane, but outside of the thylakoid space. Okay, so what's happening inside of these reactions inside of our chloroplast? So again, here's our outer membrane, here's our inner membrane, and then you have your thylakoids, these structures right here, and then inside of here's your thylakoid space. Is that within the thylakoid and within the chloroplast, you're going to have a series of chemical reactions that occur in order to finally get to and produce these large high-energy molecules. Okay, so because light energy is what we're absorbing, right? The light energy, any compound that absorbs light, these pigments are going to be existing inside the thylakoid. So chlorophyll will absorb the visible light spectrum very well, right? Except for green, right? It reflects that back. And then the rest of that energy gets converted into these energy carrier molecules as well as ATP. So photosynthesis does produce adenosine triphosphate as part of the process. Okay. So when chlorophyll absorbs light, a large fraction of that light energy is actually transferred to electrons. Okay. And so when we transfer that energy to these electrons, right, this is the process of actually making photosynthesis work. Okay. So to give you a broad overview of the different reactions that happen, there are two sets of reactions that occur inside of photosynthesis. One of the sets is the reactions that require light in order for them to occur. So we call these light-dependent reactions. They depend on light for them to occur. And then on the other side of this, we have our light-independent reactions, okay? So just know that this particular diagram is just very structuralized, that you have like the light-dependent over here, light-independent over here. Just note that inside of the chloroplast, these reactions are happening at the thylakoid or in the stroma, okay? So again, these light-dependent reactions require light in order to function. Light-independent reactions are part of the process that does not require light energy in order to go. They utilize some other form, in this case NADPH, this high energy storage molecule, to fund the energy necessary for these reactions to occur. Okay, so because these are high energy electrons, right, what is the carrier molecule to do that? We've looked at carriers before when we talked about cellular respiration. So an electron carrier is a compound that's going to be able to hold on to those high energy electrons and transfer them from one part of the chloroplast to another. Okay? So because they're able to do that, they can travel, they can go to different parts of the reaction and actually allow you, or allow the, not you, but because you can't photosynthesize, but allow the chloroplast to carry out the different parts of the independent reactions it needs. Okay, so these high energy electrons produced by chlorophyll, and again, carotenoids and anthocyanins, are highly reactive, and they require a special carrier because free high energy electrons can be dangerous for the cell because they can react, they can start stripping stuff away, and you can get different compounds forming. So you want something that's able to latch onto it and be able to transfer it very easily. Okay, so if we're thinking about this high energy molecule that's doing that, the high energy molecule in plants that carries this out is called NADPH. Okay, so we've already seen this or a similar molecule to it, NADPH, when we were talking about cellular respiration. Okay, so this high energy electron carrier molecule is sort of like a hot potato. So I like this analogy a lot. That's why I'm bringing it in. And that, you got this high energy thing, it's got lots and lots of stuff that it's ready to transfer, right? If you're trying to transfer that energy, right, you can hold on to it for a little bit, but there's a point where the molecule can't do it anymore. And so as it's transferring it, it can release it into something else that's able to absorb that energy and actually transfer the energy down the reaction line to be utilized to produce other things. So NADP plus is the carrier molecule. Okay, so NADP is able to hold on to these high energy electrons. And in that process, when it holds on to these high energy electrons, it also takes up a hydrogen ion. And that hydrogen ion actually comes from other reactions, right, in water, right? So water is actually one of our sources, is our source for that. Okay, so we're carrying the high energy electron from place to place as we go down the line. So again, we're picking it up, able to pick it up with our NADP. Our NADP attaches to the hydrogen, it carries the high energy electrons, then we can drop it off, release that energy as well as the hydrogen ion. Okay. All right, so if we're talking about the overall process of photosynthesis, right, think about photosynthesis as being the opposite of cellular respiration. Okay, so if I asked you what the products and reactants are of photosynthesis, you should essentially be taking our equation for cellular respiration and flipping it over. Okay, so if we're talking about our written description of what the reaction is that photosynthesis is using energy in the form of sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide, our reactants, into high energy sugars and oxygen, which are the products. Okay, so you're taking photosynthesis, you're taking water and carbon dioxide, reacting them together by using light energy and a whole bunch of other enzymes to produce sugars and excess oxygen as the products. So if I asked you to write the chemical formula for it, this is what I would expect to see. I would expect you to be able to tell me that 6CO2 and 6H2O react with light to produce carbon dioxide and produce glucose and oxygen gas. Okay, so carbon dioxide and water yielded with light produces sugars and oxygen. Okay, so that's what I would want you to be able to give me. So if I asked you for the formula of photosynthesis, that's the formula I would expect to see. Okay. So again, plants are using this particular process to produce a sugar, right? That sugar that they produce, in our case, we're going to just focus on glucose, right? That we're generating glucose because glucose is a structural monomer for a lot of different things, right? We use glucose for us as a major storage molecule for energy, right? That's where we get a lot of our energy from, but we also, our plants and other photosynthetic things, and we as humans, we use starches too to make various structures, is that we're using these starches to actually generate something structural that can provide support for other different organelles or functions. So in this case, we're building starches which allow us to build complex things like cellulose, to build things like pectins, which are all compounds necessary to create the structural features of plants so they can grow big and strong and hardy and healthy. Okay? So again, we're using that not only to store that, but we also use it as an intermediary for storing energy to synthesize other things, like to make other proteins, to make lipids, stuff like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these light independent and dependent reactions. So our light dependent reactions are the part of the reaction that requires light energy. So again, we're using the pigments to absorb light to excite electrons that can then get transferred using NADPH. Okay. So again, we're using light in our light-absorbing pigments, in this case chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids or anthocyanins. And again, the carotenoids and anthocyanins depends on the actual individual organism, whether or not it has it or not. But everything will have chlorophyll. Okay. So these light-dependent reactions use energy from the sun to produce ATP as part of the reaction. So you get ATP as energy, which you use to help fuel our light-independent reactions, as well as NADPH. Again, an NADP plus reacting with these high-energy electrons and a hydrogen ion to produce this molecule to carry the electrons to our light-independent reactions. And you should know that this light-dependent reaction occurs within the thylakoid membranes, right? Because that is the location of our pigments. So from that reaction, again, we're using water as our source for the electrons and our hydrogen ions. So when we use a water molecule, we actually use two of them, right, to break it down to produce four hydrogen ions. So oxygen gas gets released throughout the process of this reaction, and then we utilize the water as our source for the electrons and hydrogen ions. So note, we're breaking water up, right? We are taking our hydrogen and oxygens and splitting them, and then using those as our means for transferring energy throughout the remainder of our reaction. Okay. So plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to complete the process that is our light-independent reactions. So here we're actually taking the byproduct of cellular respiration and using that to produce a sugar. So essentially take the waste and convert it into something that is then utilized in the storage of a sugar-type compound. Okay. So in the light-independent reactions, we use the ATP and NADPH molecules that are made from our light-dependent reactions to produce these high-energy sugars. So we actually have a cyclical set of reactions that occur, right, to produce our actual sugar molecules. And so in our next video, I'll actually talk more specifically about those. So again, for light-independent reactions, it's independent of light. That means you do not need light to carry out your light-independent reactions. Okay, so these happen in the stroma, right, within our chloroplast, so outside of our thylakoids, right? And this particular process, again, using free-floating electrons, free-floating all kinds of stuff. It's a pretty complicated but really cool reaction that takes place in the stroma. Okay, so that's it for our introduction to photosynthesis. So again, the major takeaways here is to think about the pigments being the molecules that actually get excited by the light energy from the visible spectrum and areas outside of it, that we're using those electrons to actually convert water and carbon dioxide into usable sugars as well as oxygen gas as a byproduct, which is utilized by other things later for our cellular respiration. So I hope you're walking away from this quick introduction, with our general formula, our general purpose for photosynthesis, and what photosynthetic organisms do in order to carry out these processes. In our next video, what we're going to be focusing on are the actual parts of the reactions that occur in our light-independent and light-dependent reactions. We'll talk about the photosystems, where these particular things occur, so that you'll know or be able to explain, hopefully, the conventions that occur inside of photosynthesis and be able to reiterate what is going on. So I strongly encourage you to go back and review this a couple times if you're confused about something. And if you, as always, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be happy to answer them. All right, good luck.